My name is David Brennan. I'm 42 years old, and I was standing in my father's living room, listening to my stepbrother Trevor tell everyone assembled that I was a complete disappointment when he turned to me with that smirk I'd seen 100 times before and said I should stop pretending I had my life together because everyone could see I was barely scraping by. He laughed when he said it, that easy, confident laugh that came from a man who'd never questioned his place in the world. And then he looked around at my father, his mother Catherine, his wife Amanda, and their 2 teenage kids like he was waiting for them to laugh with him. He said I'd always been like this, drifting from job to job with nothing to show for it. And now here I was at 42, still renting an apartment and driving a truck that looked like it belonged in a junkyard. He said we'd both started from the same place, but we'd made different choices. And his choices had led to a 6-figure income and a house in the suburbs, while mine had led to whatever this was. And he gestured at me like I was Exhibit A in a case he'd already won. Trevor had been building to this all evening. We'd gathered at my father's house for what was supposed to be a simple Sunday dinner, but from the moment I'd walked in the door, Trevor had been making comments. He'd asked about my apartment, whether I was still month to month or if I'd finally committed to a lease. He'd mentioned how expensive rent was getting and wondered aloud how I managed on whatever income I was pulling in from my consulting work. When I'd said the work was steady, he'd raised his eyebrows like I'd just claimed to be an astronaut. He'd spent 20 minutes talking about his latest real estate investment, a commercial property downtown that was going to triple his net worth. And then he'd asked me if I'd ever thought about investing in something that could build generational wealth, or if I was content just getting by paycheck to paycheck. My father had tried to change the subject twice. Catherine had suggested we move to the dining room for dessert. But Trevor was on a roll now, energized by his own rhetoric and the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the room. He said he didn't mean to be harsh, but somebody needed to be honest with me about where I was in life. He said I was 42 with nothing to show for it, no career trajectory, no assets, no family of my own. He said it wasn't too late to turn things around, but I needed to face reality first. And reality was that I wasn't on his level, had never been on his level, and probably never would be unless I made some serious changes. He said all of this while standing in front of the fireplace with a glass of wine in his hand, looking down at me where I sat on the couch, his voice loud enough that his kids could hear every word from the dining room. I'd been quiet through all of it because that's what 20 years in the Army teaches you. How to stay calm when someone's trying to provoke you. How to measure a situation before you respond. How to recognize when talking will only make things worse. But I was done being quiet now. I stood up slowly, set down the water glass I'd been holding, and looked at Trevor with the same level expression I'd used on hostile village elders in Kandahar who'd thought they could intimidate me because I was American. I told him he was right about one thing, that we weren't on the same level. Then I told him I was a sergeant first class with the 75th Ranger Regiment, that I'd spent 2 decades serving in the United States Army with 7 combat deployments across Afghanistan and Iraq, and that the consulting work I did now was training special operations personnel for defense contractors and government agencies. I said it quietly, without raising my voice, and I watched his face change as he processed what I'd just told him. The room had gone completely silent. Trevor's wife was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. Catherine had her hand over her mouth. My father was sitting very still in his chair, his expression caught between shock and something that might have been pride. Trevor's kids had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sudden quiet. Trevor himself had lost the smirk, had lost the easy confidence, and was standing there with his wine glass frozen halfway to his mouth like he'd forgotten what he was doing. I let the silence stretch out for a few seconds, let everyone absorb what I'd said. And then I told Trevor that if he wanted to compare levels, we could do that. But he should understand that the metrics he was using weren't the only ones that mattered. I said I'd chosen a life of service over a life of accumulation, and that choice had taken me places he couldn't imagine and shown me things he'd never see. I said I'd led men in combat, made decisions where mistakes cost lives, earned the respect of people who measured worth by courage and competence instead of bank statements and property titles. I said the truck he'd mocked had taken me across 3 states to training sites where I taught people how to stay alive in situations that would break him in 10 minutes. I said the apartment I rented was 10 minutes from Fort Carson, where I worked with some of the most capable people in the military, and I'd chosen that location deliberately because proximity mattered more than ownership when your work actually had consequences. Trevor tried to say something about not knowing, about how I'd never mentioned any of this, but the words came out weak and defensive. I told him he'd never asked. I told him he'd spent 23 years making assumptions about who I was based on what he could see from his limited perspective, and those assumptions had told him more about himself than they'd ever told him about me. I said I'd let him believe whatever he wanted, because correcting him would have required me to care about his opinion, and I'd stopped caring about that a long time ago. But now that he'd decided to make his contempt public, I'd decided it was time to make the truth public too. My father stood up then and asked if we could all take a moment to breathe. Catherine was crying quietly. Trevor's wife had her arm around their daughter, who looked confused and uncomfortable. Trevor was still standing by the fireplace, but he'd set down his wine glass, and his hands were in his pockets. His whole posture collapsed inward, like a man who'd just realized he'd walked into a room he didn't understand. I told my father I was going to head out, that I'd said what needed saying, and there wasn't much point in staying for dessert. He walked me to the door, and in the hallway, away from everyone else. He put his hand on my shoulder and said he wished I'd told him years ago. I said it hadn't seemed important. He said it was important, that everything I'd done was important, and he was sorry he'd let so much time pass without knowing. I drove home that night, replaying the evening in my head, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the quiet sense that something had finally broken that needed breaking. 23 years of Trevor's condescension had been building to this moment. All the small comments and dismissive looks and casual cruelty that he'd thought went unnoticed. I'd noticed all of it. I'd filed it away in that part of my brain where you store information about people who aren't worth your emotional energy, and I'd gone on with my life. But tonight he'd pushed it too far, had made his contempt so public and so absolute that silence had stopped being an option. The problem with people like Trevor is they live in a world where success has only one definition, and anything that doesn't fit that definition gets categorized as failure. He'd built his identity around material achievement, around the visible markers of status that let other people know he'd won at life. The house, the car, the investment properties, the wife and kids who looked good in family photos. All of it was part of a carefully constructed image that he needed other people to validate. And part of that validation came from having someone to look down on. Someone whose life could serve as a cautionary tale about what happens when you don't play the game right. I'd been that person for him. The stepbrother who'd never quite figured things out, who didn't have a real career or a mortgage or a retirement account that compound interest had been working on for 2 decades. From his perspective, I was living proof that his choices had been correct, that his path was the right path, that his definition of success was the only one that mattered. He'd needed me to be a failure so he could feel secure in his own success. And I'd let him believe it, because the truth was more complicated than he was capable of understanding, and I hadn't seen any benefit in trying to educate him. But tonight had been different. Tonight he'd done it in front of the whole family, had made sure everyone heard him explain exactly how disappointed he was in my life choices, and something about the public nature of it, the performance of superiority he'd put on for his wife and kids and my father, had triggered something in me that staying quiet wouldn't fix. He'd earned the truth, not because he deserved it, but because the lie had gone on long enough that it was starting to affect how other people saw me. My father's expression when Trevor had been talking, the uncomfortable pity in Catherine's eyes, the way Trevor's wife had looked at me like I was some kind of cautionary tale, all of it had made clear that my silence had been interpreted as confirmation of Trevor's narrative. The next morning, my father called. He said he hadn't slept, had stayed up thinking about all the years I'd spent in the army while he'd known nothing about it. He asked me why I'd never told him. I gave him the simple answer, which was that he'd never asked, But we both knew that wasn't the whole story. The whole story had to do with the distance that had grown between us after he'd remarried. The sense that his new family had become his real family, while I'd become something more like an obligation. I'd joined the army at 19, right after he'd married Catherine, and by the time I'd come home from my first deployment, Trevor had already established himself as the son who was present, who showed up for holidays and birthdays, who gave my father grandchildren and reasons to be proud. I'd never competed with that. I'd never tried to reclaim space in my father's life that had already been filled by someone else. I'd just kept doing my job, kept deploying when the army sent me, kept coming back to an apartment instead of a home, because home was something I'd stopped believing I had. The military became its own kind of family, the kind built on shared experience instead of blood, and that had been enough. My father's life had moved on without me, and I'd accepted that as the cost of the choices I'd made. But now he was on the phone saying he wished he'd known, and I could hear the regret in his voice. He said Trevor had called him that morning, had tried to explain what had happened, had said things about being stressed at work, and not meaning to come across as harsh as he had. My father had cut him off and told him that what he'd said wasn't harsh, it was cruel, and there was a difference. He said Catherine was upset, that she'd told Trevor he owed me an apology, that his behavior had been unacceptable regardless of what he'd known or not known about my background. Trevor apparently hadn't responded well to that, had said he'd been trying to help, that someone needed to give me a reality check, that he'd had my best interests at heart. My father said he'd told Trevor that if those were his best interests, he didn't want to see what Trevor considered harmful. He said the conversation had ended badly, that Trevor had left the house angry, and now there was tension in the family that my father didn't know how to resolve. I told him he didn't need to resolve it, that Trevor and I were adults, and we'd figure out whatever we needed to figure out. But my father said it wasn't that simple, that Catherine was caught in the middle, that the kids were asking questions, that everything felt broken in a way he didn't know how to fix. I sat with that for a while after we hung up, thinking about the ways families fracture when someone tells a truth that everyone has been avoiding. Trevor's contempt for me hadn't appeared overnight. It had been there for years, growing quietly in the space between who he thought I was and who I actually was. Last night had just been the moment when it became impossible to ignore. And now everyone was dealing with the fallout, trying to figure out how to move forward when the foundation they'd been standing on had turned out to be built on assumptions that weren't true. 3 days later, Trevor's wife Amanda called me. I almost didn't answer because I couldn't imagine what she'd want to say that would make any of this better. But curiosity got the better of me. Her voice was tight when she spoke, like she'd rehearsed what she was going to say but was already regretting having to say it. She told me Trevor was embarrassed about what had happened, that he'd been out of line, that he wanted to apologize but didn't know how to approach me after the way things had ended. I listened without interrupting and waited to see where she was going with this. She said Trevor had been under a lot of pressure at work, that a deal he'd been counting on had fallen through, that he'd been taking out his stress on everyone around him. She said that didn't excuse what he'd said to me, but it might explain why he'd been so aggressive. She said he'd always looked up to me when we were younger, that he'd felt like he had to prove himself because I was the older brother, and he was just the stepkid trying to find his place in the family. She said a lot of other things that sounded like she was trying to rewrite history in a way that made Trevor look more sympathetic. I told her I appreciated the call, but Trevor's motivations weren't my concern. I told her he'd said what he'd said, and those words had revealed how he actually felt about me, and no amount of context about work stress or family dynamics was going to change that. I told her if Trevor wanted to apologize, he had my number, but I wasn't interested in hearing apologies that were motivated by social pressure or guilt. Amanda was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised me. She said Trevor had been different since that night, quieter, less certain about things he used to be certain about. She said it was like something had cracked in him. I asked her what she meant. She said Trevor had built his whole identity around being successful, around being the one who'd figured out how to win at life. She said he measured himself against other people constantly, always comparing, always making sure he was ahead. She said learning that I'd spent 20 years in the Rangers, that I'd served in combat, that I'd done things he couldn't imagine, had shaken something fundamental in how he saw the world. It had forced him to consider that maybe success wasn't what he'd thought it was, that maybe the metrics he'd been using to measure his worth weren't the only ones that mattered. I told her that sounded like something Trevor needed to work out for himself. She said she knew that, but she was calling because their kids had been asking questions, had wanted to know why Uncle David had been in the army, and why Dad hadn't known about it, and why everyone had been so upset. She said she'd tried to explain it in a way that didn't make Trevor look bad, but it was hard to explain without acknowledging that their father had been wrong about something important. She said she was worried about how this was affecting the family, about the tension it was creating, about whether things would ever go back to normal. I told her things weren't going to go back to normal because normal had been built on a lie, and you can't maintain a lie once everyone knows it's a lie. I told her that what Trevor had said to me wasn't new. It was just the first time he'd said it out loud in front of witnesses. I told her I'd been aware of his contempt for years, had watched him look down on me at every family gathering, had heard the subtle digs about my life choices and my lack of conventional success. The only thing that had changed was that now everyone else had heard it too, and that made it impossible to pretend everything was fine. Amanda said she understood. She said she'd talk to Trevor, try to get him to reach out to me directly instead of hiding behind her. I told her I wasn't hiding from him, that he could call me any time, but I wasn't going to make it easy for him by pretending this was a simple misunderstanding. She thanked me for taking her call and hung up. I sat there afterward thinking about Trevor's kids, about what it must be like to discover that your father isn't quite who you thought he was, that his confidence might have been covering up insecurity, that his certainty about other people might have been a way to avoid questioning himself. 2 weeks passed before Trevor called. I was at work when my phone rang, in the middle of a training session at Fort Carson, and I saw his name on the screen and almost sent it to voicemail. But I stepped outside and answered. His voice sounded different, smaller somehow, like he'd been practicing what to say and still wasn't sure he'd get it right. He said he owed me an apology. He said what he'd said that night had been out of line, that he'd been wrong to assume things about my life, that he'd let his own insecurities turn into cruelty directed at me. I listened without responding. He kept talking, filling the silence with explanations and justifications and admissions that sounded like they'd been pulled out of him with pliers. He said he'd always felt like he had to prove himself in the family, that being the stepson had made him feel like he was on trial, that watching me drift away from the family had made him feel like he'd won something. He said learning about my service had made him realize he hadn't won anything, that there was no competition, that he'd been measuring himself against someone who wasn't even playing the same game. When he finally stopped talking, I told him I accepted his apology, but that accepting it didn't mean forgetting what he'd said. I told him the problem wasn't that he'd been ignorant about my background. It was that he'd felt entitled to judge me without knowing anything real about my life. I told him that kind of arrogance doesn't disappear just because you learn one piece of information that contradicts it. I told him if he was serious about changing, he'd have to do more than apologize to me. He'd have to examine why he'd been so eager to believe I was failing in the first place. Thanksgiving came 6 weeks after that phone call. My father invited me to dinner and told me Trevor's family would be there. He said he'd understand if I wanted to skip it, but he hoped I'd come. He said the family needed to start healing, and healing required everyone to be in the same room. I told him I'd think about it. I spent 3 days thinking about it, and finally decided that avoiding Trevor forever wasn't the answer. I'd said what needed saying, he'd apologized, and now we'd see if any of it had actually changed anything. I showed up at 6 on Thanksgiving evening. Trevor's SUV was already in the driveway, parked in the same spot it had occupied in October. My truck looked just as shabby next to it, but I didn't care the way I might have cared before. Catherine answered the door and hugged me longer than usual, like she was trying to apologize through physical contact for everything that had happened. She told me everyone was in the living room and asked if I wanted a drink. I said water was fine. Trevor was sitting on the couch with his daughter. He stood up when he saw me and we shook hands. It was awkward, formal, the kind of handshake you give someone at a business meeting when you're both pretending yesterday's argument never happened. His wife smiled at me from across the room. His son nodded from where he was leaning against the wall with his phone. My father looked relieved, like he'd been holding his breath waiting to see if we'd all get through the first 5 minutes without incident. Dinner was quieter than usual. Trevor didn't dominate the conversation the way he normally did. He asked questions instead of making statements, listened instead of waiting for his turn to talk. When someone asked about his work, he gave short answers without turning them into stories about his superiority. When Amanda brought up their Italy trip, he mentioned it briefly, and then changed the subject. It was like watching someone perform a version of himself that he didn't quite believe in yet, trying on humility like an uncomfortable suit. At one point, his daughter asked me about the army. She wanted to know what deployments were like, whether I'd been scared, whether I'd met people from other countries. I gave her the sanitized version, the one you give teenagers who are curious, but don't need the full weight of what combat actually means. Trevor listened without interrupting. When I finished, his daughter asked if I'd ever thought about staying in the army. I told her I had, but 20 years had felt like enough. She asked what I did now. I told her about the training work, about teaching people skills they'd need in difficult situations. She said that sounded important. I said it was. Trevor's son asked if I'd ever been shot at. I said yes. He asked if I'd shot back. I said that was complicated. He looked like he wanted to ask more questions, but Amanda cut him off and suggested we clear the table for dessert. Catherine brought out pie and coffee. My father asked about my plans for Christmas. I said I'd probably work through it, that the holidays weren't much different from any other day when you didn't have family you were close to. My father looked hurt when I said that. He told me I did have family, that I was always welcome here, that he wanted me to stop treating myself like an outsider. I didn't know what to say to that, because in a lot of ways I was an outsider, had been for 23 years. And one dinner where everyone was on their best behavior didn't change the history of distance between us. But I could see that he meant it, that he was trying to rebuild something he'd let deteriorate, and that effort counted for something, even if I wasn't sure what the result would be. After dinner, Trevor asked if he could talk to me outside. We stood on the back deck in the cold November air, our breath visible in the porch light. He said he'd been thinking a lot about what I'd told him on the phone, about examining why he'd been so eager to believe I was failing. He said he'd realized that it had made him feel secure, like as long as I was struggling, he was winning. He said that was a terrible way to live, constantly comparing yourself to other people, constantly needing them to be less so you could be more. He said he wanted to do better. He said he wanted his kids to see him as someone who respected people for who they were instead of what they had. He said he knew one conversation wasn't going to fix everything between us, but he wanted me to know he was trying. I told him I could see he was trying. I told him change was hard, especially when it required admitting you'd been wrong about fundamental things. I told him I respected the effort, even if I wasn't sure yet where it would lead. We stood there for a while longer, not saying much, just existing in the same space without hostility. It wasn't friendship, it wasn't even warmth, but it was something different from what had been there before. A tentative acknowledgement that we were both complicated people who'd hurt each other in different ways, and maybe there was room for something better if we both kept working at it. Christmas came and I went to my father's house. Trevor's family was there again, and this time the awkwardness had lessened into something that felt almost like normalcy. We exchanged gifts, nothing expensive or meaningful, just the kind of generic presents people buy when they're trying to maintain family traditions without knowing each other well enough to choose something personal. Trevor gave me a book about military history. I gave his kids gift cards. We ate Catherine's traditional Christmas dinner and talked about safe topics that didn't require anyone to be vulnerable. What I learned from all of this, what I'm still learning, is that most people carry around stories about themselves and everyone around them. And those stories feel true until something forces you to question them. Trevor had a story where he was the successful one, and I was the cautionary tale. That story had served him well for 23 years, had given him confidence and purpose, and a clear sense of his place in the world. When I disrupted that story by revealing information he didn't have, it shook his entire framework for understanding himself. I'd had my own story too, one where I was the outsider who didn't need anyone's approval, who'd built a life around service and sacrifice while the rest of my family played status games I didn't care about. That story had also felt true, had given me permission to disconnect from people who would have judged me anyway. But watching my father's face when he'd learned about my service, seeing the genuine regret there, had forced me to question whether I'd been as noble in my isolation as I'd told myself I was. The truth was more complicated than either story allowed. Trevor had been cruel, but he'd also been insecure. I'd been justified in my silence, but I'd also been avoiding vulnerability. My father had been absent, but he'd also been doing his best with a complicated family situation. None of us were quite the people we'd thought we were, and that realization had created space for something different to exist between us. In February, my father called with news that he'd been diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer. The doctors were optimistic about treatment, but it was still cancer, still serious. He asked if I'd come stay with him and Catherine for a few weeks while he recovered from surgery. I took leave from work and moved into their guest room. Trevor came by most days after work, bringing groceries or helping with yard work, or just sitting with our father while Catherine ran errands. We developed a routine, the three of us, built around my father's recovery schedule and the practical needs of keeping a household running. During those weeks, Trevor and I talked more than we had in 2 decades. Not about anything profound, just the small conversations that happen when you're both doing dishes or folding laundry or sitting in a hospital waiting room. He asked about my deployments sometimes, careful questions that showed he was trying to understand something outside his experience. I asked about his work, about the deals he was chasing and the clients he was managing. We found common ground in unexpected places, discovered we both liked the same old movies, both thought Catherine's coffee was too weak, both worried about our father in ways we couldn't quite articulate. My father's surgery went well. The cancer was removed completely, and his prognosis was excellent. I stayed another week to make sure he was stable, and then I went back to Colorado. Before I left, Trevor asked if I'd be willing to come back for Easter, said his kids had been asking when they'd see me again. I said I'd try. He said that would mean a lot to them. I thought he might have meant it would mean a lot to him too, but he didn't say that part out loud. I drove home thinking about the strange way relationships can break and rebuild, how sometimes you have to destroy the false version before you can construct something real. Trevor and I weren't friends. We probably never would be. But we'd moved past the worst of what we'd been, had found a way to exist in the same family without one of us needing to be superior and the other inferior. That felt like enough. It felt like more than I'd thought was possible back in October when he'd been standing in my father's living room telling everyone I was a disappointment. What I understand now is that dignity doesn't come from other people's recognition of your worth. It comes from knowing your worth, regardless of whether anyone else sees it. I'd spent 20 years serving my country in ways that most people would never know about, would never understand, would never properly value. That service had been real and meaningful, whether Trevor acknowledged it or not. His contempt hadn't diminished what I'd done. His eventual respect didn't enhance it. The work stood on its own, independent of anyone's judgment. But there was something valuable in the truth being spoken out loud, in not having to carry the weight of other people's wrong assumptions. I'd thought I didn't care what Trevor believed about me, and in a lot of ways, I didn't. But I'd underestimated how much energy it took to be consistently misunderstood, to watch someone construct a false narrative about your life and never bother to question their own certainty. Correcting that narrative hadn't been about proving anything to Trevor. It had been about refusing to participate in a story that diminished what I'd actually done. My name is David Brennan. I'm 42 years old. I spent 20 years in the United States Army, 7 deployments, more firefights than I can count, more decisions with life or death consequences than anyone should have to make. I'm not better than Trevor. I'm not worse than Trevor. I'm different from Trevor, and that difference has value independent of his ability to recognize it. I don't need his respect, but I also won't accept his contempt. That's the line I drew that night in my father's living room, and it's a line I'll keep drawing for as long as I need to. The humiliation Trevor tried to inflict on me that evening was meant to reinforce a hierarchy he'd invented, one where his version of success was the only version that mattered. But humiliation only works if you accept the premise that someone else gets to define your worth. I'd never accepted that premise. I'd just never bothered to explicitly reject it until Trevor forced the moment. When he said I wasn't on his level, he was right. I wasn't on his level. I was on a completely different plane of existence, one he couldn't see from where he was standing. That's what he realized when I told him about the Rangers, about the deployments, about the life I'd lived while he was accumulating property and commission checks. Not that I was better than him, but that his entire framework for measuring people was inadequate. That realization broke something in him, and maybe that breaking was necessary. Maybe he needed to understand that the world was bigger and more complex than his corner of it, that there were types of achievement and sacrifice and courage that wouldn't show up on a balance sheet or a real estate portfolio. I don't know what happens next with Trevor. I don't know if the changes I saw in him will last, or if he'll eventually slide back into the comfortable certainty of believing his way is the only way. What I know is that I'm done pretending to be less than I am to make other people comfortable. I'm done staying quiet while people who don't know me make assumptions about my life. I'm done treating my service as something I should hide or minimize or apologize for. I did things that mattered. I lived a life of purpose. And if Trevor or anyone else wants to measure that against their own metrics and find it wanting, that's their problem, not mine.